Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Do you like scary movies? On today's episode of Central Booking, we're kicking off the spooky season with Padraic Maroney. Patrick is the author of the new book It All Began with a Scream, an unauthorized celebration of the iconic horror film franchise published to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the first installment's release. Patrick first saw Scream during its initial theatrical run in 1996 and says his life was forever changed. He embarked on a professional writing career while still in high school, eventually becoming a freelance entertainment journalist. He currently works as a marketing professional in Philadelphia and has won awards for both. It All Began with a Scream combines Patrick's passion for the movies with his talents as a storyteller, and draws upon more than 24 interviews with on-screen and behind-the-camera talent to reveal the inside story of Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson's iconic slasher series, which revitalized the genre with its brilliant melding of horror, humor, and self-awareness. Now, to borrow a line from Scream 2, I offer this compliment to the author, and in actual sincerity. I couldn't put it down. Insightful, probing, I just really loved your book. Okay, boys and ghouls, it's time to go behind the screams with Padraic Maroney. You're not scared, are ya? Hey everybody, welcome back to Central Booking. So we are kicking off Halloween season with this episode. I am really excited today to be speaking with Padraic Maroney, whose new book, It All Began with a Scream, is out right now from BearManor Media. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, John.
It's my pleasure. So I was telling you before we started recording that this is very exciting for me because I feel very passionate about the Scream films, but I am surrounded by people who are not nearly as passionate as I am. Nobody wants to geek out with me, so I feel like this is my opportunity to do so.
Definitely.
All right, so I have to ask you, I feel like this is the logical place to start. Tell us about your first experience seeing Scream, and why do you think it's resonated so profoundly with you?
So my first experience was actually, I was in middle school and my brother took me and a bunch of my friends on opening night to see it. It was back when they were like cracking down on kids seeing R-rated movies. So like he had to like fight with the box office person. So that was my first experience with it. And I think, you know, the reason it resonated is, I mean, it's such a well-crafted script. And I think that, you know, all the pieces came together for it. You had a script that was genuinely scary, which you can't say about most movies. You had a cast that you could relate to and really made you feel for the characters. You had a director who really knew what he was doing. So I think it was just a lot of the different pieces that came together. You know, I think in film, sometimes you always hear about how a movie didn't turn out as good as they thought it would or something. And I think that this was probably something that they all just loved doing so much that it came out and people felt that and they have just clung to it. And it was such a big part, I think, for a lot of people's childhoods, when, you know, and the nostalgia that I think you're now seeing that generation come up, and you're seeing their love for the movie, you know, multiply. And that's why it's still so, you know, present in pop culture today.
That's terrific. Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that question when I was planning on asking you that, because as a kid, I did not like horror movies, but I always liked, you know, scary books, in particular mysteries. And so I didn't see the first Scream in theaters, but I'd heard so much about it that when it came out on VHS, I remember like going to the store and buying the one that had Drew Barrymore's face on the cover. And it was New Year's Eve, 1997 into 98, because Scream 2 had just come out, and like everybody in my house was asleep. So like I popped it in, I turned off all the lights. I was friggin' terrified. Like I remember at the end of the movie turning every light on as I made myself my way to the bedroom, because I was like, something is going to pop out and gut me. But I think that, like you said, all the pieces came together. It was really a clever script. It was scary. It was funny. You could tell that people were really having a good time with it. And for me, I think it was such a good mystery. Like, in addition to being a horror movie, it had such a great mystery in its core. And so that really appealed to me. But it's funny because, you say a movie like this transformed your life and people look at you like you're nuts. But I think that we're both sort of examples where we can say that this was kind of one of the defining moments of our lives. And it sort of led us to do some of the things that we've done into our adulthood. So I wanted to ask you about that next, because if I remember correctly, in the book, you do sort of acknowledge that seeing Scream and having that resonate, you sort of helped in shaping your career path. So I'm wondering if you can expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so there was just something like when I was a kid, like I was like, oh, I always liked film and I wanted to do something with film. And I was a kid in like kindergarten. I was like, oh, I'm going to be an actor. And I remember standing up in my kindergarten graduation and giving like a 2-sentence speech about wanting to go to Hollywood. But over the years, I was like, maybe I don't want to be in front of the camera. And, it was with Scream, and seeing how Kevin Williamson was able to so effectively, and like you said, people who weren't fans of horror movies still gravitate to these movies because they're not just a slasher film. Actually, some of the actors that I talked to in the book, they're like, I don't like horror movies, but with the humor and the mystery, it was okay for me to watch this. And I think that's another thing that has kept these movies so relevant is it's not just like Jason Voorhees chopping people up. There's humor and there's a mystery component to it. And so seeing how that was with how the movies were resonating and how people were feeling, like I was like, well, maybe being a writer is a path, because you can affect change, you can affect people with it. So I actually began professionally writing for my local newspaper the year after 1997. And one of my first articles was why I love Scream. My ninth grade English teacher had recommended that I start writing for this section that was written by teenagers in the area. And it just kind of kept building from there, that I went on to start doing film reviews and features with actors and filmmakers. And then I went to school for communications, and then the pandemic hit and I decided to write a book.
Right. Yeah, all of a sudden you have all this time and nothing to do with it. So writing a book is a nice way to, it's very productive of you, you say.
And I figured, if we're all home, people in Hollywood are probably also home. And if they're like me and live alone, they probably are looking for something to fill their time. So I was like, they'll probably want to talk to me, or they'll have more time to talk to me. So this is perfect.
Yeah, that's kind of brilliant. And it's also a beautiful transition, because I wanted to ask you, one, what inspired you to embark on this book at this point in time? But pandemic, seems to make a lot of sense. But, there are great interviews in this book. I mean, it's over 24 people in front of the camera, people behind the camera, some very recognizable names, but also, some people who are a bit more obscure. So can you tell us, how you went about getting in touch with these people and securing these interviews?
Yeah, so I am a type A anal retentive person. So when I first started my research, what I did was I went on IMDb and I just made a list of everyone who was in the films. I mean, like I made a certain cutoff point, like the cheerleaders in the first movie made the cutoff, but like, the ticket taker that gives Maureen the costume in Scream 2 didn't.
Right.
But and then a lot of the filmmakers, producers, editors. I did it. There was over 100 people, and then I just started researching their publicists, their managers, looking on. I contacted some through social media, and so yeah, it just really was about being super organized. I started color coding the Excel spreadsheet, and I had tabs. Everyone thought I was like losing my mind because it was like all these different tabs in different colors. I even like color coded the note cards when I started doing note cards for it. I probably have like OCD. I don't even know, but but yeah. So I just started researching, and then just cold emailing people, and I was actually surprised how quickly and how many people were more than happy, and they were all very generous with their time and with sending photos and referring other people. So once I got the first couple done, it kind of had just a snowball effect.
Sure. Yeah, I was very impressed when I saw the list of names, but I love too, there's some of the bigger names in terms of actors, but there are some people who, if you're not, a super fan, you might not know. So you get some insights that really are not common at all. So it was really great to hear from some different people. And I think we are probably two of the few people who've talked to some of the same people because, like you, years and years ago when I started writing, I don't know if you remember examiner.com. It was a thing like, 10, 15 years ago. And I wrote for them and I did a book column. And then, it was announced that they were going to do Scream 4. And I said, all right, well, I'm already doing a book column, but I'm going to do a Scream column too. And my wife said, are you crazy? Like, you work a full-time job, you work, this other column. Why are you going to do this? And I said, because I'm going to be following this obsessively anyway. So, I might as well share it with other people. And it became a huge, big thing. But I got to talk to Lynn McCree, and she said, nobody's really ever tracked me down before. I think I found her on Facebook or something, and Marco Beltrami, some other people. But it's kind of interesting, how you can find people and the fact that they all have stories that they want to share because they all had such a good experience. So we will, I guess, get into that a bit more in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, going film by film, 1 through 4, two things. So first, I'm going to ask you if you can tell us 1 or 2 things about each film that you specifically were surprised to learn in your research that maybe you didn't know before. And then after that, I might ask you, to give us 1 or 2 facts per film that you think the more common fan might be surprised to know.
For the first movie, I don't know how much people know the school battle, how intense it got. I know, especially like super fans will know at the end of the credits that it says no thank you whatsoever. I don't know that, and I didn't realize that it became like a national story tied into the Polly Klaas case and everything like that. I didn't realize how big it got. I just knew that they had turned them down. I think another fact that people might not know is, excuse me, sorry, is if about the mask and how the Weinsteins were really pressuring Wes when filming the opening scene and how that they didn't think the movie was working. And some of the cast were afraid that he was going to get fired, right. Which you think is absurd looking at the movie now. It's like, how could you see footage from the scene and not think it's scary and it's not working? So I think those are probably 2 of the facts for the first movie. The second one, I would say the script leak. I don't know if the more common fan knows about that and how it got rewritten. And a more I guess maybe just like the timeline of it, of how quickly it came into it was really, the movie came out in December 1996, and they were having conversations in January, February of let's do this.
Right.
So I think that was something, and how that impacted who came back for it on the crew side. So I think those were some of the interesting things, along with the story that Jamie Kennedy told about Scooter Braun being the club promoter in Atlanta back then.
Right.
Scream 3, I feel like there's a lot that people know or presume to know about Scream 3, especially in the Scream chats. I keep hearing about people talk about Angelina being the second killer. And so I think they'd be surprised how quickly it was dismissed, and it wasn't like it was in the script and everything. And also, I think they'd probably be kind of surprised by how the cast didn't know. Even Scott Foley or Emily Mortimer didn't know who the killer was during filming, because they never really saw a full script. For the more common fan, I think the changes to the opening and how the film itself changed due to Columbine is interesting, and how Kevin Williamson took the initial idea and used that to do the following that he made with Kevin Bacon. And one thing that I think, which is why I included it in the book, is I think people always really enjoy the casting information and the idea of who might have been in it. So I think especially with Scream 4, hearing that Lauren Graham, and I didn't know Gabrielle Union almost was cast. And it's kind of interesting to picture her in that role. I'll just tease it so that they have to pick up the book to know which role we're talking about.
Brilliant.
But I think, for a more, hardcore fan, I think the insight that Rory Culkin gives about how he viewed, because there's a lot of online chatter about Charlie as one of the killers, and spoiler alert from 10 years ago if no one has seen Scream 4. But there's a lot of talk about how people are saying, that they don't necessarily think Charlie's that strong of a killer. And so I think it's interesting to see where Rory was coming from in his approach.
Yeah, I found that really surprising. I don't think I'd heard him, speak too much about that role. So it kind of, makes me view the film a little bit differently, which I think is great, because you sort of inspired this whole dialogue, and then you realize what he really brought to the character and sort of how that affected his personality when filming the movie, because he did actually know, that he was one of the killers. It's an interesting case, sort of with Scream 4, everybody sort of knew where it was going. Well, the people in those roles, the killers didn't change. It was one of the few things that was sort of set in stone with Scream 4 was the direction that it was going in. But I really appreciated his insights, because I felt like that was the first time I'd ever heard him speak in any kind of depth about the role. So very insightful. I thought I would ask you too a bit about Wes Craven, because as we know, he passed a couple of years ago. But this book really is honoring him and his legacy, and so many people speak of him, in sort of the family-like atmosphere, the calm that he created on set, and it sort of flies in the face of what you might think about the typical person who makes horror movies for a living. Wes Craven, he was a teacher, he was a philosopher, a very quiet man. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about, his character and what it was like having people share those remembrances of him with you.
Well, first off, I will say that hearing everyone talk so lovingly about him made me that much more bummed out that I didn't get to meet him or get to talk to him. He's, like you said, he was so loved, and almost no one that I talked to had a negative word to say about him, which I feel like is probably unheard of in Hollywood.
I would agree.
I mean, I can't say that with any sort of authority, but I feel like in Hollywood, it's pretty hard to find someone that is universally beloved. And like you said, he kind of, like Scream, he kind of subverted the expectations of what a horror director was. And I don't know if it's in the book, but Jamie Kennedy, he had a great story that he was talking to Wes one night in his bedroom, and Wes drove a cab for a while in New York, and he had his cabbie license or medallion next to his bed, and Jamie asked why he had it, and Wes was like, so I remember never to go back there. So like he really remembered where he was from, and like you said, the philosopher aspect, so I think it just, and he respected his actors and really loved what he was doing. I got the sense that he loved being on set. He was usually really happy there, is the sense that I got. And, and like you said, like he did create a film family with the collaborators that he worked with. I mean, Marianne Maddalena, he worked with for, I think it was 30 years. Patrick Lussier, he worked with for 20, like, Nick Massandrea was like 20, 30 years. Like these were like long-term relationships that he had, and he was very loyal. People were very loyal to him. And I think that really says a lot about him as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like Marianne Maddalena was like the perfect partner for him, because you said, he just wanted to be on set making movies, and she was sort of, taking care of the business aspects and kind of the headaches. And there was sort of a great balance between them. And I think everybody should be so fortunate to have, that kind of partnership to equal out the balances. But I will say too, I was really, really fortunate. I got to meet Wes Craven twice, incredibly briefly, but such a nice guy, and he made time for everybody. Once was in New York, and he made sure to, stay behind after, because people were asking during the Q&A, they brought things, would he sign them? And he did. He didn't just fly right out of there. He actually met with people in the lobby and on the street and did pictures and autographs, which I thought was really cool, because that's not necessarily common.
No, not at all. I mean, off topic of Scream, like there was a singer back in 2005 that like we were literally holding each other like in a hug pose to take a photo, and her, like, people ripped her away and said she's got to go. Like, so for him to be like, to make it a priority to stay behind and talk with fans and everything, I think again it shows the type of person that he was.
Yeah, it was great. And I think, he seemed so surprised to see how taken, people were with him. And, there were people there far younger than me who had copies of, his oldest movies. And it's like, my gosh, you probably weren't born for 20 years, until after that thing was in theaters. But it was really cool to see how he'd reached so many, age groups, different generations, and somehow they all found their way to him and he to them, which is really cool. But I did want to speak a little bit more about Wes Craven, because I think that one of the things that people might not know is, yes, he directed all 4 of the initial Scream films, but particularly when it comes to 3 and 4, he ended up being far more involved in sort of the writing and the shaping of the stories as we ended up coming to see them. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, so especially 3, when Kevin wasn't involved. They had Aaron Kruger, who was relatively new at the time, but only had him for like 2 weeks, and then had another screenwriter who was coming in uncredited to work on it and do rewrites. But and also by the time the second movie was coming around, Kevin was, you know, launching Dawson's Creek. His career was red hot. So Nick Massandrea, I believe it was, said like as the movies went on, Kevin wasn't on set as much. And I should also clarify, even though Kevin didn't write Scream 3, he was still involved. He was a producer, and he gave them feedback. Like, he's the reason that the opening for Scream 3 is the way it is. So it's not like he completely divorced himself of it. But I think, you know, by the time, you know, as Kevin was there less, you know, Wes had lived with these movies, and he was really like the day-to-day, almost, you know, the showrunner, I think, in a lot of ways, him and Marianne and Kathy. But, you know, with Wes being a writer and everything, like he wrote the scene where Maureen comes and haunts Sydney in Scream 3. And he was originally contacted to write a script for Scream 4. You know, so I think he really was probably by the end the driving creative force for the movies. But I also found it interesting, and I remembered back in the day when it happened, but from the beginning, Dimension kind of put it their foot in the sand and said that he was the creator, with the lawsuit with Sony when they tried to promote I Know What You Did Last Summer as from the creator of Scream, and Dimension sued them in a tit for tat back and forth. So they were even saying from 1997 that Wes was the creator. So I think, yeah, it was really, you know, he lived in this universe and he loved everyone in it. And, you know, I get the sense that he loved the characters too. So he really became the creative driving force, I think.
Sure. And, you know, I wanted to ask you about Scream 3 and 4, particularly for a moment, because those tend to be the two films that are sort of the most divisive among fans. I mean, talk about opening Pandora's box. My God.
What are you talking about?
It's craziness. But one of the things that I've learned, you know, increasingly over the years is just how involved, you know, the Weinsteins were, and particularly Bob Weinstein, in sort of creating all this drama. Whereas I think initially a lot of us sort of, and I will raise my hand and say, I think that, you know, initially we felt like Aaron Kruger really had a lot to do with how Scream 3, you know, came out and some of its shortcomings. Whereas really, you know, he came in and we probably got a far better movie than we would have without his involvement. But there was so much going on behind the scenes with the Weinsteins and what their creative vision was and what they wanted to see, that, you know, the stories sort of kept changing. And to the point where Scream 3 and 4 really did not have final shooting scripts. They were sort of making them up as they went, and they were already in production before scripts were finalized. So I'm wondering if you can just, you know, speak to those two movies specifically and sort of the behind the scenes drama with Dimension and the Weinsteins, because I think that is something that people are only now really starting to appreciate.
Well, if you want to talk about Weinstein meddling, the movie Cursed is the textbook example. But, you know, we won't go there.
Yeah, I mean, an apt name if ever there was one.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I think I think part of the issue with specifically Scream 3 was the timing, which they couldn't control. Is, you know, they didn't know Columbine was going to happen. And it, you know, and especially how that affected the country, it really wouldn't have made sense to rush into production a movie about teenagers killing each other. Like, it just wouldn't have. So I think that kind of set off a chain reaction. But at the same time, talking more about the meddling, like when you have a film franchise that is coming down the home stretch for the concluding chapter, to give the filmmakers a writer who isn't familiar intimately, I don't know how much he had watched the movies beforehand,
right?
But he wasn't intimately involved with the movies, and to give him 2 weeks to write a script and then say, okay, now you're on to other projects, like, what were they thinking? Like, come on.
It drives me crazy because you look at the first two movies and they were probably by far the most successful, both commercially and critically. And why is that? Well, Wes Craven directed them, Kevin Williamson largely wrote them, and they sort of had the freedom to follow through on their vision and make the movies that they wanted to make. They are the creative visionaries, and it always baffles me why the people behind the scenes who don't actually make the movies for a living are the ones thinking that they should be calling the shots. It's like, you're not the director, you're not the writer.
Well, and Kathy Conrad talks about that a little bit, about the dichotomy of the creatives versus the like studio, and the push and pull of that, which came into play with the third. And I think, it's just, I think, and she says too that there's always that one movie in every franchise that people kind of cling to and use as their rally cry of, well, this was where the series went downhill, or this is the one that stands out. Like, Nightmare on Elm Street, for years, it was always the second one, even though it's started to have more of a rebirth now. Jason Takes Manhattan, Halloween 6, there's always one of them. And, I think people try to use the behind the scenes drama on Scream 3, especially because that was 2000. It was when, the entertainment industry media was really, getting bigger and more intimately covering things. So more was known about what was happening. And little comments like Parker Posey saying that she only did the movie for the money, which was true, but kind of taken out of context.
Right.
Caused a fan backlash for a little bit. And I'll be honest, Scream 3 is not my favorite in the trilogy, because I do find that it leans into the humor a little more, which is something that Wes added into it also. And I think it's also a little disjointed. I feel like you almost have like two movies in one. Yeah. For the first half, you have Sydney, and then you have the Hollywood one. And I think, again, part of that was out of their control, because Nev Campbell said, I'm only going to work on this film for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So and to get the movie out, they had to film in the summer. So they had to write around that. So I think there was a lot of things beyond Weinstein's meddling. But the daily early morning phone calls where he yelled at them about things definitely didn't help, I don't think. So I think that was kind of the issue with I don't want to say issue because it makes it sound negative. And even though, like I said, Scream 3 isn't my favorite in the series, I don't think it's necessarily a bad movie.
Right.
And the people who like Scream 3 love Scream 3. So I don't want, and there are a lot of good things. I think probably the opening of Scream 3 is probably the second best in the series. Especially with it being someone that we know, and I think it's just kind of a tight, so there is a lot of good. I don't think it's a bad movie. I think there was just a lot of things that almost that they were set up in a lot of ways, whereas Kismically, the first movie, everything came together to work. I think for the third one, a lot of things came together to work against them.
Right.
The fourth, I think, is definitely more on Weinstein. And I loved the story from Nico Tortorella when they had the dinner and Nico came in late and was just like, where's our script? Like, we don't have a script. So I think with that and with Weinstein being kind of Machiavellian, trying to hire three people to write a script, it isn't going to set the best tone. And then not having a finalized script when you start, like it's just going to create problems for everyone. I think, again, going back to Wes, the fact that he shielded the cast from a lot of that, so that they were able, like, the cast were like, we had a good time.
Right.
So he shielded them from a lot. And so I think, again, like that shows the type of director he was and how he kept his sets. But yeah, I think that the Weinstein brothers were just, they were, and there's a story also that Marianne Madalena said where they did their own cut of Music of the Heart and showed it to Wes. And it's like, it goes back again to not trusting the vision of the creative people, and letting their vision show. And, they do test screenings. If it comes back at a 20, then that creative vision didn't work and you can, do things. But I think that they, from what I was told, that they're just come from a bullying background and that's how they think everything has to work.
Yeah, and it's funny. I read a book last year, and I can't remember the name, but basically it was huge book, probably like 500 pages, and it was all about the Halloween sequels that were never made.
I know that book.
Yeah, and it was just wild. I mean, it really gave me an insight into the Weinsteins and particularly Bob. But there were so many sequels that could have been that he interfered with, or like you said, with Scream 3 or 4, multiple scripts being written by multiple people without everybody knowing that there's actually all these alternate versions out there, and it was just wild thinking of what's been, what could have been, what still might be. Crazy. But to speak to Scream 3, I agree. I think that's become probably the most divisive movie, and it's probably the one that I've had the most conflicted relationship with. But I think now I can appreciate it more. I do think that the elements were there and they sort of just didn't gel in the way that maybe they could have. But an interesting story, some really good performances. I always thought, like you said, it's sort of two movies, particularly the first half, where you have the Sydney storyline and the Hollywood storyline, and it almost feels like a really, really great movie with Nev Campbell, and then sort of a mediocre movie with some of the other people. But so many brilliant ideas there that just...
Yeah, and I mean, and I'll be honest, Parker Posey is what really saves the Hollywood story.
Yeah,
like
totally.
Jennifer Jolie, like she was the hands down is probably my favorite thing about that movie, but yeah, I think if they had again, they had more time to work on it instead of, it being on the fly, which again, partly was Weinstein, part of it was, Columbine happened in March or April, and they were getting ready to film that summer. So they didn't have much time to really develop this new idea. So I think that really, like you said, I think if they could have developed it a little bit more and had just a little bit more time, the issue is then they would have just had to wait a whole other year. And, when time is money and other projects can come along, do you want to take that risk that it then falls apart?
Right. And I think too, the ultimate irony with Scream 3 is kind of, they were pushing, because they wanted it to be out in 1999. Like they wanted to close the trilogy without moving into the new millennium. And then it got pushed back 2 months anyway, because they had to go re-edit and do some additional shooting. So I always just think, look at that. Like they could have gone a little bit slower and it would have been 2000 anyway. But you know what? Let me just circle back because we talked a lot about Wes Craven, but I want to ask you, about Kevin Williamson and what you think it is about his style, his dialogue, his storytelling that really benefited the first two films, because there's not really anybody quite like him. And you can tell a Kevin Williamson line typically from a line written by somebody else.
Yeah, Kevin Williamson, which I will say, he's like my white whale when it came to my writing career. Between when I started writing in 97 through 2002, when I went to, actually 2005, when I graduated college, I interviewed probably about like 2 or 3 dozen people who worked with him in an attempt to like just interview him. And he just continues to evade me. But I think that he brought something back that we hadn't had in a while. He was able to write similar to John Hughes, but with the dripping tartness and sharpness of like the movie Heathers. And so he was able to combine that type of those tones to horror movies. And even with Dawson's Creek and Teaching Mrs. Tingle and, Wasteland and his non-horror projects, you can still tell that it's him because of the current pop culture talking points and the way that they just effortlessly infuse them into the dialogue without it seeing. And the thing is, he does it in a way that it doesn't date the material and that it doesn't feel out of place. He treats the characters very intelligently. And again, I think he respects all the characters, right, so that I think you see that come across. And again, if you look at Dawson's Creek, everyone can relate to those characters. And it was a very semi-autobiographical show for him. But I think everyone can relate to having gone through a lot of that stuff, or, the faculty, where aliens are taking over your school, you might not be able to relate to as much, but you can relate to those characters and what they're going through personally outside of the extraordinary things. And I think that has always been his strength, is really crafting characters that are fully thought out and, that you really end up caring about. Even if you don't like them, you care about them. Because I don't know that anyone's going to be like, oh yeah, I loved Mickey in Scream 2. Right. But, so I think, he was a sociopath from the beginning, but I think that Kevin is really able to create characters though that you remember and everything.
Yeah, I agree. I think I worship at the altar of Kevin Williamson because, in addition to loving horror movies, I love books. And when I think about the ones that I love the most and remember the most, it's the ones that have that really distinct authorial voice. The books are different, the plots are different, but you can pick it up and say, yes, this is so-and-so, because they are just that distinct. And sort of to speak to Kevin Williamson's brilliance and sort of how prescient he is about things, I think that, people finally now are starting to realize sort of what a clever, ahead of its time movie Scream 4 was, particularly, Jill's motivation for doing what she did. At the time, people were like, that's bonkers, but he kind of saw it all coming, and it's...
She just wants fans. That's all she doesn't need friends.
No, who needs friends? I need fans.
And even Robbie Mercer with the webcam,
Right.
and we talk about it in the book, like these weren't things that people were really doing in 2010 when they filmed the movie. Like, influencer wasn't really a word, and now you look back and you're like, oh, okay, like, yeah, like you could release this movie now and it would be very current. And I think, like you said, I think that's why you're starting to see, because like you said, 3 and 4, they have their fans, and it's weird because it feels like those that like 3 don't like 4 as much, and those that like 4 don't like 3 as much. But I think, Scream 4 came out and it wasn't a hit at the time. And I think you're seeing now people looking at it through a different lens, and really discovering that there was more to it. And again, just like Scream 3, there are some issues with it. It's not a perfect movie, but I think it got a lot more, it got trashed more than it should have. It was a little unfairly trashed.
No, I agree. And I think now, like all the people who are detractors of Scream 4 back in 2011 who haven't seen it since then, you should really give it a watch and realize sort of how spot on it is now, because talk about, cutting social commentary. I mean, it is so resonant. But anyway.
And I think also, my personal opinion, I feel like the tone of Scream 4 is probably the closest to the original of any of the movies. And so that's why that's what I really liked about it, is it felt like it could almost be a sequel directly to Scream 1, and like they could just be, companion films. But the tone of 2 was a little bit slower, and 3 had more of the humor, whereas I really felt that Scream 4 was the closest to capturing the tone of the first one.
Yeah, I agree. And, I loved that movie when it came out, and I really still love it now. And I think that it's even more relatable now. But, Gail sort of had her groove back. And I think Nev is always kind of a powerhouse in the Sydney role. But let me ask you, too. So, I think most people at this point probably know that December marks the 25th anniversary of Scream's debuting in theaters. And then January, we're actually getting a 5th film, Scream 5, Scream 2022, whatever you want to call it. Another thing we will come to blows over, is what this movie should be named. But I think, I feel very optimistic about it because in essence, it seems almost to have the setup of the first film where the scripts and the players were in place before production began, so it's not being sort of assembled as they go. But let me ask you, what are your hopes and expectations for the new Scream film?
I am trying, so I think there's a danger of putting expectations on films, because I think you're really setting yourself up for kind of disappointment. Really, all I'm hoping for is a good, scary movie that is true to the characters and the mythos of Scream, that it doesn't pull a Halloween 6 and suddenly start becoming supernatural or something. Like, I just am hoping that it's a good movie, scary, and that it is true to the characters and everything. Like, again, I know on Facebook, in the Facebook groups, everyone's talking about this person's going to die or that person. I mean, obviously, I don't necessarily want to see all 3 of them die, but if one of them or 2 of them, if it was done and it was true to the characters, I would understand.
Yeah.
Deep down, I secretly want Gail to get her own spin-off. I have been, for like the last 5-10 years, I've been telling everyone, I want like a Netflix show of Gail's adventures.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Like a Murder, She Wrote where like she's investigating these different murders, but like
yes.
like one movie. I mean, one investigation, and Gail is up there bitch slapping, if I can say that, everyone, and revitalizing her tarnished brand. Like that's what. And even even if she does get killed off in one of the movies, like have it take place before then. Right. But like I think that's what we need is a streaming show of Gail, traveling as a reporter, and those are her books that she ends up writing.
I kind of love that. Netflix, are you listening? Like,
I'm trying on this book tour. Anyone who asks, I'm trying to put that out into the ether. I will sign away any rights I have to the idea. I just want it to happen.
That is such a good idea. And I agree, in terms of expectations for the movie, I guess the more you expect from it, the more you want from it, the more likely you are to be disappointed. I think the only thing I really want from this film, one is to sort of capture the essence of the earlier movies, but also I think that Sydney needs to have her happy ending. And my guess, I think the most badass thing that you could do is give her a happy ending off screen so we know that she still exists in the Scream world, but doesn't have to be involved, in the sequels that are going to be inevitable after this one. 6, 7, 8, Sydney will be fine, but she will be somewhere off screen, not in Woodsboro, because why would you want to be in Woodsboro, right?
Well, and that's the thing I was thinking the other day, like this one takes place in Woodsboro again. And I was thinking, in terms of what would draw Sydney back to Woodsboro, and without giving away what my theory is, why would she keep coming back to this town where every time she does, there's a massacre?
Right.
I would be like, there is Zoom, just hold me up, right. Dial me in. Like I am fine in my wood cabin. Like I'm not doing this.
Yeah. And I totally get it, because I know they want to recreate, Woodsboro for the new generation of characters and people who are just going to be entering this world. But yeah, nothing good comes when Sydney's in Woodsboro. I think you and I probably have a very similar theory about what draws her back to town. But I also think that if we are correct in that theory, if that is what happens, there really won't be any reason for her to ever have to come back to Woodsboro, because what really will be there for her. Yeah. So I will start to wind this down before your computer dies, but 2 more questions for you. First, I just want to ask you, you obviously have taken something that you're very passionate about and you've spun it into this great book, also sort of in a career trajectory, if I could speak correctly. What advice, would you give to aspiring writers or people who have a particular, interest that others might not be able to relate to? How might they be able to draw on that to set their path going forward?
Well, I think in terms of writing a book, I think it really helps for it to be something that you are passionate about. I joke with my friends, I'm like, I didn't realize there was so much reading involved with writing a book. I thought you just wrote. You didn't have to read the manuscript 17 times. So if it's something that you don't care about or don't have interest in, it's going to be very tedious. So I think that's step one, is just, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, do something that you have an interest in, and really use that as the foundation, and then go from there. And also just allow yourself to really, don't set constraints on, it needs to be done by this time, or I need to have this many pages, or because, as a writer, writing articles and interviews, how often do you set out with one thing and you're expecting to be here and then it ends up over here? I think that it can be dangerous to kind of set limits on things. I mean, within reason, obviously like no one would have read a 1,000-page Scream book, but I mean, maybe like three of us, but
I would have read it.
but I think, really don't put expectations on yourself, and pressure. Just let it kind of come to you and do it with what feels right.
That's excellent advice. All right, so we will wind down. So I should say, in the words of Mrs. Loomis to Gail Weathers about the Woodsboro murders and Scream 2, your book, insightful, probing. I just really loved your book, man. So everybody's got to get it. It all began with the Scream. If you like scary movies, if you like Scream movies, if you're just interested in media, this is the book for you. It's out right now from Padraic Maroney. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your insights.
Well, John, before we wind down, I have to ask you a question. Being that you are a Scream 4 fan, where do you fall on the Kirby debate of whether she lived or died?
I gotta say, I really liked Kirby and I did not expect to. So I would love, like, I don't have any illusions that she's going to be in the new film, but if she popped back up at some point, I would be really, really happy because we did never see her die. And in the commentary for Scream 4, Wes Craven even sort of said she's still moving, so I think that there were plans to revisit her character. I'd be all for it if it was done right.
Yeah, because that seems like that's also one of the biggest debates on
totally. Whether Team Kirby over here. How about you?
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like I expected her to be a Randy light and kind of be a little annoying, and she didn't. And I think a lot of that credit goes to Hayden for knowing, how much to push and pull back. But yeah, I think her and Rebecca, I think, were some of my favorite new characters in Scream 4. So I'm not, it's not an expectation that she'll be back, but again, I wouldn't be upset if she was.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty cool. And it's so funny too, because I mean, so few of the new generation survived that movie, like Judy Hicks did, and she was the adult. But it would be nice to have one of the teenagers walk away from that movie.
Yeah, exactly. None of the teenagers did.
No. Well, I guess we'll know soon enough. We'll have to reconvene. And the cool thing is by the time that this video debuts, we should be getting our trailer next week too. So there will be lots to talk about and maybe we'll have a couple of answers, probably just more questions. But in the meantime, people can go to their favorite retailer and get It All Began with a Scream. Really good book. Thank you so much again, Patrick, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, John. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.